There's essentially an infinite number of combinations of graphics cards, processors, system resolutions, refresh rates, monitor types and settings, graphics drivers, and more that can and will result in drastically different results for everybody. Not to mention the wide range of preferences and requirements each individual may have. So if you're looking for a simple dump of here's my settings, everybody use these, and that's all you want, this probably isn't the video for you. Most that are familiar with my brand of informational video know that I prefer the teach a man to fish sort of video. The more people that understand these things, the better the community will be together. So let's dive into it. Hey, this is future video editing Veritas interrupting script writing Veritas real quick before we get started. This wasn't originally planned, but I'll be damned if it isn't so appropriate right now. Now, I started gathering footage, recording, scripting, and editing this video yesterday morning around 9 a.m. Now, I've been flat out cranking this thing out all day today and yesterday, stopping really only to make myself some food and go to the bathroom and, sleep occasionally. And it's literally 9 p.m. and I've basically been sitting here for 12 hours straight yesterday and 12 hours straight today, laser focused and doing the Lord's work, and I wouldn't have been as ready to go as I have been if it wasn't for me slamming 2 shakers of Juju throughout the day yesterday and today. Now, I've got all my shakers here, my water supply, and the mini fridge, and I've got every flavor of Juju stored here ready to go. Now, I mix 1 or 2 of these bad boys up every day to try to limit the amount of coffee and Red Bulls I drink that my stomach does not enjoy anymore because I'm a boomer now, and I get a shitload of energy in a convenient package that tastes phenomenally good. No lie, no bullshit. Every single flavor does, and it's less expensive than the coffee and energy drinks that I'd otherwise have to leave the safety of quarantine to go pick up down the street. So if you're looking for something new to drink that gives you a ton of energy, is cheaper, more convenient, probably more healthy, and tastes better than pretty much anything else out there, and you want to support me and all the work that goes into videos like this, the biggest thing you can do is head on over to jujuenergy.com, I'll put the link in the description, and use code Veritas10 to get 10% off your order. Okay, my rant's over, let's get back into the science, shall we? We're going to be looking into what each setting means, what it does, compare a range of possible values for the different settings, and compare the performance costs of each. Now, that being said, let's start by getting some of my tech specs out of the way real quick. Now, if you guys are interested in actually like a full breakdown of my entire stream room setup, my gaming rig, and maybe even, all of my musical instruments, guitars, and, my recording equipment and stuff like that, even all the memorabilia and shit that I collect, let me know if you guys are interested in that, because I can go ahead and do more of an in-depth video. Yeah, I'd be happy to. I think that'd be kind of fun. But what I'm doing right now is simply just to give you an idea for what I'm working with so that you can keep it in mind when you see the actual gameplay, frame rate numbers, and the like. Part of what finally pushed me to make this video in the first place was that I was fortunate enough to have been sent a Founders Edition RTX 3080 graphics card before they were available to the public. Now, while other folks were doing unboxing videos and teardown reviews and whatever else, Chaboy was hard at work elbow deep in Tarkov's graphical innards to see if this new-gen GPU could handle the shitstorm that EFT was invariably going to throw at it. And my gaming rig was built for me a year or 2 ago by Origin, was sent to me when I took part in the nvidia Stream On competition, which I won, by the way, thank you all. It had originally come with a 2080 Ti, but that is now going over to my streaming rig, replacing a GTX 1060 probably as soon as this video is done. The gaming rig has an Intel Core i7 9700K, 8-core, 3.6 GHz processor, and is connected to an Asus 27-inch 1440p 165Hz gaming monitor. So with this in mind, I really wanted to see the kind of quality differences that I could get out of Tarkov with different settings, and see how it would run and look under different conditions. With my previous GPU, I didn't have much issues running the game at 1440p with pretty much all the settings maxed or on ultra. I could play with passable frame rates as long as you ignore the major stutters that I would encounter all the time. I'm sure I could have gotten much higher performance if I had turned down some of the settings a bit, but I don't know, I like my videos and my streams to look as good as possible, so I'm okay with less than optimal performance as long as it's playable if the gameplay is high quality and immersive. Now, as mentioned before this video and research that came with it, I generally turned everything up all the way, even though I didn't really understand what many of the settings were, what they did, and what sort of performance impact they'd have. Now that I've done the research that I needed to do to put together this video, I've learned a ton, and some of it was significant enough to have me change the settings that I have, turn some of them down, turn some of them up. But let me share this information with you and show you some of the relevant details that I think we'd all benefit from knowing. Now let's start with Vsync. Vsync is responsible for the synchronization of a game's frame rate and the refresh rate of the monitor, and is most commonly discussed when dealing with things like screen tearing. Now, this is a topic, honestly, I really don't want to get deep into here. It's a whole other ball of wax, and I don't really have strong opinions about things like, whether or not it causes input lag or whatever else folks talk about related to it. But I will say that I have Vsync enabled in game but then disabled for Tarkov in my NVIDIA control panel application settings, and I play the game in full screen mode. These few things allow me to capture my gameplay at the quality that I want without getting screen tearing when I'm recording through my capture card, and has the effect of unlocking the frame rate limit that you see in the game so I can go above the 120 FPS limit. Now, if any of those things matter to you, this option is available to you, otherwise we can move right along. I'm just going to briefly touch on texture quality first, then we get out of the way. This is one of those things I feel pretty strongly about, mostly because the textures in Tarkov aren't the greatest most of the time. So keeping this down at low makes everything look like one of those Christmas specials they animated in Claymation when I was a kid. But turning it up to ultra actually makes them look presentable most of the time, and only costs, a few FPS, so to me it's kind of a no-brainer. Now, the texture streaming option is there, as I understand it, primarily for lower-end graphics cards with limited VRAM, allowing the game to dynamically use lower quality textures when necessary. Now, this can improve your performance on, like I said, lower-end rigs, but if you're able to get a decent frame rate with it on ultra, then I'd say stick with the texture streaming off and just keep it on ultra. Now, the texture quality setting is the only setting that requires a full game restart upon making changes, which is a major pain in the ass for testing purposes, especially when trying to do things like side-by-side comparisons. So for the vast majority of tests I do throughout this video, I have this set to one of the two ultra settings to avoid restarting a million times, and I'm not including that in all the different combinations of settings that I have here. Just keep that in mind. Alright, moving on, let's talk about 3 graphics settings that are all related to the same thing: shadows. Now, there are 3 separate settings for shadows. There's quality, visibility, and grass shadows. Quality settings can be anywhere from low to ultra. Visibility is a slider from 40 on the low end to 200 maxed out, which may or may not indicate meters, I'm not totally sure. And grass shadows is a toggle you can have on or off. Now let's take a look at some different combinations of quality and visibility settings first to get an idea for what they do. Now, it can be kind of hard to suss out the difference between the two settings in many of these cases, especially changing multiple settings at once. So let's take a look at some side-by-side comparisons with only a single setting different. Let's compare the same distance setting of 40 between low and ultra quality settings. So as you can see, higher quality settings tend to darken and smooth out shadows that are visible within the specified range. And given that both of these visibility settings are low at 40, we can see that there's a pretty clear difference between shadows that are nearby. But because the visibility setting is lower, there's no difference between the shading off in the distance. Now, alternatively, we can look at the same quality setting of medium, but compare it between 2 different visibility settings, 40 and 95. Looking again at nearby shadows, we can see that there doesn't seem to be a significant difference in how they appear. Conversely, if we look at slightly longer distances, what we do see is that shadows that weren't really rendered at all before are now suddenly visible. Now let's take a look at both settings minimum compared to both maxed out to see the distance and quality differences between both. Let's take a look now into the grass shadows toggle, which is pretty much exactly what you'd think. It adds a more realistic layer of shading to the grass in the environment, which of course is most notable when it's sunny, and there's of course grass around you. Now, I was surprised that this only affected my frame rate by like 1 or 2 FPS for how significant of an effect you get here. I thought that was really cool. Alright, let's combine all 3 and look at all 3 of them minimum or off and maximum or on. Now, I notice a few things here that are worth mentioning. The first is just how fucking nice all of the shadows make the environment look, not to mention how it can really tame the brightness that all that grass can blast at you depending on some of your post-effect settings, brightness, stuff like that. Now, more shadows is definitely more appealing to at least my eyes, but think about if an enemy was creeping over by this big rock over here, or maybe coming up on these trees over there. Shadows being visible or not actually has the potential to be a noteworthy game changer in combat situations. So in summary, higher quality and visibility when it comes to shadows is another setting that can make the game look amazing with a minimal performance cost, as long as the environment and lighting conditions cooperate. But seeing shadows can also mean you don't see someone creeping up within them. My personal recommendation here is to turn the quality up as far as you can, keep the visibility somewhere in the middle, like around the 80 to 100 range, and turn grass shadows on. That'll give you a nice balance between enjoying your surroundings and being able to see nearby threats effectively. Alright, now let's talk about object LOD quality. LOD stands for Level of Detail, and this setting is one very often confused, especially in the realm of Escape from Tarkov. LOD refers to the quality of the models, or more specifically the number of polygons used to render the geometries of those models. The higher the polygons, the more details and realistic the objects look in the scene, but of course that means more work for the system to load, render, shade, etc. Now, games dynamically swap different quality versions of the same models depending on their distance from the player in the scene, as a lower quality version of a model really far away can be indistinguishable from a full-size version at the same distance. Increasing the LOD quality setting in Tarkov has the effect of upping the quality of the objects in the environment so that they are more detailed than they otherwise would be at different distances from the player. Now, in some cases, at certain distances, the quality of these objects can be lowered to the point of, well, non-existence. This is what's known as culling. At certain thresholds, there's no reason to even bother rendering a low-poly version of an object if it's far enough away. But of course, what we experience as a result of this behavior in many cases is that objects suddenly pop into view out of nowhere as you approach. Having a lower LOD quality setting is typically the cause of this when it comes to objects in the environment. So in a nutshell, if you want to see more objects at higher detail over longer distances, turn this setting up as long as your frames don't suffer too much. And if you want to control a similar behavior for the environment itself, let's take a look at our next section, overall visibility. Now, this setting controls the distance at which objects become visible or not. Ranging from 400 at the low end to 3000 maxed out. The higher this value is, the more stuff can be seen at further distances, such as trees, buildings, mountains, terrain, etc. Notice how as you increase the overall visibility value, previously invisible chunks of the map, such as the opposite side of the beach with its hills and trees, suddenly becomes visible. Now, this is not going to be a live or die sort of thing, but filling out the backdrop of the environment definitely can be beneficial to immersion and to your ability to localize yourself in a map. Generally speaking, these distances are too far and the amount of detail that you can see at these distances too small to have any major impact on anything like combat. The effect might be something you would never notice yourself, either due to things like lighting or weather conditions, or just not being super perceptive. But increasing this setting can contribute to a more immersive experience as you travel through a more filled out and realistic environment, and it comes at a minimal performance cost. Now, my personal recommendation for this setting is that you turn it up as high as you can until you start to encounter any issues with FPS loss. Our next graphic setting to discuss is anti-aliasing. Now, have you ever tried to draw something in Microsoft Paint, especially something with like round edges, and no matter how hard you try, you can't get the curved lines to look smooth? Anti-aliasing to the rescue. Now, the effect can be achieved using different algorithms with different resulting image qualities and performance hits. For example, FXAA is Tarkov's first anti-aliasing option. FXAA stands for Fast Approximate Anti-Aliasing, and without getting into the specifics of the algorithm, it basically tries to smooth out the lines created by groups of high contrast pixels that create the look of rough edges in a still image. TAA stands for Temporal Anti-Aliasing, which, as its name suggests, tackles the issue from a slightly different angle, time. Anti-aliasing issues can be much more evident when looking at objects in motion, and has been described as being like a flickering or shimmering effect. Take a look at the edge of this EOTech site and notice how obvious the issue is when we zoom in and the character is slowly moving the gun up and down as they breathe. It's like there's a white and black, jagged, stroked line sliding up and down the edge. What TAA attempts to do is take adjacent frames temporally and blend them, resulting in a sort of middle ground image that effectively smooths out the resulting aliasing. So put another way, the primary difference between FXAA and TAA is that FXAA acts on individual frames, which are essentially still images, and processes them so they appear less jagged, whereas TAA acts on multiple neighboring frames in a series, blending them together to smooth out the effect. Now, even though anti-aliasing attempts to increase the perceived quality of the rendered images, one could argue that the blurring or smoothing that some methods result in actually serve to lower the quality of the resulting image. Although I personally would argue that in many cases the blurring or smoothing effect results in a much more natural look in the end. Now, my personal opinion is that the aliasing issues in Tarkov are significantly more noticeable on objects in motion, and FXAA is simply not as good as TAA at remedying this issue. Now, I didn't personally notice a massive difference between TAA and TAA high, so just going with TAA is my recommendation for most people in this case. Moving right along, let's take a look at resampling. Now, resampling is a technique that in some ways is an alternative to other anti-aliasing options discussed before. What it attempts to do is improve the quality of the graphics in the game by increasing the resolution, or supersampling, or alternatively subsampling, which is decreasing the resolution, and then resizing the image to fit your resolution. Now, I've heard some interesting results from folks who have lower end rigs. If they lower their resolution and choose something like 2x or 4x supersampling, they can get a decent image quality as before with a bit of a performance boost. Now, my personal experience with this setting is that turning it down below 1x or off gives me in the range of an additional, 20, 30, 40 FPS, but honestly makes the game look just really shitty and blurry. And turning it up to 2x can make it look slightly nicer at the cost of anywhere from 30 to 50 FPS. But turning it up to 4x doesn't really seem to improve anything, oftentimes ends up looking worse. Completely tanks my frames to like a fourth of what they normally are, and gives me what seems like a noticeable input lag or something like that. It's just really bad. Even turning my resolution down to 1080 and comparing 0.5x, 1x, 2x, and 4x, I see similar sorts of results. Now, resampling has the most significant performance impact of all the settings I've tested, and has the least compelling change to the quality of the graphics, at least on my higher end system. I'd suggest giving a couple different combinations of resolution and resampling a try, paying close attention to how it affects your frame rate and the overall feeling of the game for you personally, but I think most people are going to want to stick with 1x or off for this setting. Now on to HBAO, which stands for Horizon-Based Ambient Occlusion. Of course, this term packs a bunch of fun technical terms into one handy little initialism, and this process is a bit harder to explain in simpler terms, but I'll try my best. Ultimately, HBAO's goal is to add depth and detail to your scene by using as much information as possible about the environment itself. Now, if this kind of thing interests you, you can Google the phrase normal mapping if you'd like to lose your afternoon reading technical papers and watching interesting videos. At the end of the day, HBAO results in a more realistically lit and shaded environment. Now, as was the case with the shadows, sometimes realism doesn't equate to visibility, so parts of the scene do tend to look darker with HBAO on higher settings versus lower or off. But again, it all comes down to your personal visual preference and what sort of impact it's going to have on your frame rate. Now, interestingly enough, I didn't experience any notable FPS loss across the various settings. Alright, let's bust out 3 settings real quick that don't really need a ton of detail or explanation: sharpness, Z-blur, and noise. Let's start with Z-blur. What it basically is just an added depth of field effect that pretty much only results in the butt end of your gun, the part closest to your face, to be blurry relative to the rest of it. It seems most people don't like this setting, but I actually think it looks kind of cool, and I'm kind of a sucker for depth of field effects, and it has no noticeable performance impact, so I personally keep it on. Noise is a visual effect that, as far as I can tell, is really only there for cinematic reasons. You can think of it like a sort of film grain effect, and could be cool in an immersive video or something like that if you're a content creator, but otherwise I think it's just kind of ugly, especially when coupled with some of the post effects and other graphics settings that affect the sharpness, contrast, clarity, etc. Also, there doesn't seem to really be any performance difference with it on versus off. Alright, lastly, let's take a look at sharpness, which is a blanket term used to describe the clarity of an image in terms of contrast and or focus. Now again, this setting doesn't seem to have a significant performance cost, and given how blurry and washed out many people feel Tarkov's default look and feel is, I think most folks are probably going to benefit from having this setting somewhere between 1 and 3-ish, depending on their personal preference. SSR, or Screen Space Reflections, adds realistic environmental reflections to many of the reflective surfaces in the game. Now, this is going to be noticeable when looking at things like bodies of water and even damp floors and puddles. Now, this setting has a range of performance costs from small on the low end to moderate on the ultra end, and to some it may be a bit subtle, and especially during the heat of their standard gameplay experience, but it's really hard to beat the look and immersion of a scene like this with it on. Now on to the second to last setting, Anisotropic Filtering. To understand this setting a bit better, let's take a look at the etymology of the word anisotropic. If we look at the root components of the word, an meaning not, iso meaning the same, and tropic related to tropism, which relates loosely to direction or angle, What this term essentially means is that processing is applied to textures of objects in the environment that are at varying angles from the camera in the scene. This attempts to remedy the same aliasing issues discussed previously, but is different in practice as it acts on higher level textures rather than the pixels that make up those textures, and because of this can achieve similar results without the unwanted effect of blurring mentioned earlier. Now, of course, that's all theoretical because no matter how much I tried, I couldn't find any examples in the environment in-game where the settings seemed to actually do anything noticeable. In hindsight, it's most likely that these textures were on ultra, making them higher quality and maybe not being susceptible to the same sort of issues. I'm not really sure, but honestly, at this point, there's no way in hell I'm going to go back to test this on a lower resolution or texture quality settings, so we're just going to move right along. If you're into photography, you might be familiar with the concept of chromatic aberrations, which is an effect created by a camera lens not perfectly focusing all of the light in the appropriate parts of an image, which gives the effect of a slight blur and color shift along the edges of objects in the scene. Now, this is really only there to enhance any cinematic look and feel you may be going for, and I've personally heard mixed things about how it affects performance. Some say it's large, others, including myself, didn't really notice much of a difference either way. This may be again because I was comparing them with post effects and other settings on the high end, so maybe it would be more noticeable if I had less color saturation, sharpening, or other effects. At this point, I tend to keep this setting off as it doesn't really make much of a difference either way. Alright, and finally, let's briefly talk about post-effects processing. So Tarkov is a beautiful game, but you gotta admit that it can be a bit stark and kind of dreary and a little grayscale at times. Now, while this may be the intentional look and feel that devs want us to experience, it can also make for a visually lackluster gameplay experience. This is another one of those bits where I'm gonna say you should personally open up the game in various lighting conditions, indoors, outdoors, on different maps, press the visualize button so you can see the changes in real time, and tweak the knobs until it looks good to your eyes on your rig with your monitor settings. Most people's setups are going to be different enough where just taking someone else's raw numbers and applying them to your settings is not going to look the same as what they see on their screen. Hell, even this scene looks different if I compare them side by side on my gaming rig and my editing PC due to the monitor differences alone. Now, in my testing, I only saw a few FPS difference between post-effects processing on versus off, and it didn't seem like changing any of the values between minimum and maximum had any real further effect on the performance, so adjust these to your heart's content. Alright, so to finish up, let me show you all the rest of my side-by-side comparisons I collected with a bunch of different settings in all sorts of different environments so that you can get an idea at a high level how the game visually compares with all settings low versus medium and then high, some with post-effects, some without. Keep a lookout for the last comparison I do in the video where I compare 1080p low settings and no post-effects to 1440p with most of the settings maxed out and post-effects added up on the radar tower in reserve. It's actually pretty crazy. I'm going to be finishing another follow-up video related to this in the next few days where I show all of my personal graphics settings and show all of the beautiful and immersive Tarkov scenery and all of the glory that my new NVIDIA 3080 graphics card can muster alongside my Tarkov-inspired lo-fi music. Now, if you want to know my graphics and post-effects settings and to enjoy some chill Tarkov vibes along with some of the highest quality Tarkov video you'll see to date, keep a lookout for that one. It'll be called The Sights and Sounds of Tarkov. Anyway, thanks for watching, everybody. I hope you learned something today that'll make your Tarkov experience a little bit better. And don't forget to head over to jujuenergy.com and use code Veritas10 to support me and get 10% off. Peace.